Hello, this is Jed Brewer with Study Groups and Below the Line Club. It's very nice to have you on the call today. We are going to talk about supply chain optimization for fuel and lubricants distributors, and very pleased with this panel of experts that we have. You should be able to see the pictures on your screen of each of our panelists. The first folks that we're going to be talking about today are with Commonwealth Supply Chain Advisors, and Ian Hobkirk is the founder and president of Commonwealth, and Steve Spratt, a senior consultant with Commonwealth. Just high level of Commonwealth, they're a supply chain consulting firm. They help people like you develop strategies to drive out costs in our environment today. Finding technology and strategies to be more efficient is critical as we're all striving to drive out costs. And they help improve plant and distribution centers. And one of their specialists is in fuel and lubricants. They work across many industries, but with a specialty in fuels and lubricants to really understand your business. And in addition to Ian and Steve, we're also going to have two study group members, Ron Huntington, who's the supply chain director at Wilcox Flegel. They're a full-line petroleum marketer in the Pacific Northwest, near the Portland, Oregon area, headquartered, and operate in Washington and Oregon and a little bit in surrounding states. And Ron will share more about his business a little bit later on. And also study group member Ed Looney, who's the executive vice president at Texas Enterprises, which is a fuel and lubricants distributor, and they operate throughout the entire state of Texas, which is a pretty large geographic area and a little bit into surrounding states as well. So a little bit later on, Ed will share a little bit more about Texas Enterprises too. But Ron and Ed are going to be talking about their experience in trying to optimize their own supply chains and ultimately make themselves more efficient. So it should be a really good call today. I have you muted, so if you have any questions, please type those into the GoToWebinar dialog box. There's a little place to type in questions. I'll be able to see those, and then I will relay them on to our presenters at an appropriate time. We want this to be as interactive as possible. In addition, we are recording this webinar, and I will send out afterwards the replay of the recording if you want to share it with a colleague. I'll also send out the slide deck that Ian, Steve, Ron, and Ed are going to talk through today, so you'll have that as your reference or to be able to share with a friend or colleague. So with that introduction, Steve, I want to turn it to you and Ian, I guess I will allow you to start first.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jed. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to the audience here. As you mentioned, Commonwealth Supply Chain Advisors is a consulting firm. We specialize in helping companies develop their supply chain strategies and also do very specific facility level studies as well to make their distribution centers and their plants more efficient. So, this is an exciting opportunity to present over the course of those two projects, and also give you an opportunity to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, exactly what some of the benefits were that the companies have derived from doing these sorts of things. So we're going to talk about some of the tools that we use and that are available in the marketplace to use to do these kinds of analysis. I think it'll be a really interesting webinar. So thanks to everyone for joining. The agenda here, I'll just briefly go over. So, we're first going to talk about an overview of supply chain optimization, specifically for fuel and lubricant distributors. We're going to talk about why it's so important to look at optimizing your supply chain today. What is supply chain optimization? How is it done? What are some of the tools and techniques and tricks that we've learned along the way? And what are the expected benefits from a study like that? So Steve will be presenting most of that content. And then we're going to have a discussion of these two representative projects here, again, Wilcox Flegel and Texas Enterprises, and I think that'll be the really interesting part of this. So Good. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Steve Spratt, who heads up Commonwealth's Supply Chain Strategy practice. Steve, take it away.
Very good. Very good. Thank you for the introduction, Ian. So our goal today is to inform you on tools and techniques to help you address some of these specific inefficiencies or questions you may have about your operation. So first, I thought it'd be beneficial to run through what some of those potential questions are. So some typical questions that we would answer in a supply chain optimization are, how many facilities do I need? Where should they be located? Where should I locate my repack operation? For a given SKU, should I repack it or purchase it? What can I do to reduce transportation costs? How can I improve customer service? How many daily routes should I have? Where should I position my fuel trucks? What equipment type should I have in my fleet? How can I improve demand responsiveness to my customers? How can I improve stock availability? Which SKUs should I be stocking at each location? Should I have more or less inter-facility transfers? What can I do to reduce inventory? How can I reduce the total number of stocking locations? And how should I manage slow-moving items? So a supply chain optimization effort is designed to address these questions in a structured and quantitative manner. So let's take a different view of what that looks like. So supply chain optimization, what is it? A strategic analysis to define the number, the location, and the function of facilities. Our overall objective, as is illustrated here, is to minimize total cost, right? Of course, we want to maintain service levels, preserve business continuity. But I want you to focus on this being primarily a quantitative effort, right? And attempt to lower overall logistics costs, right? Alternatively, to the term supply chain optimization, you may hear folks use the term supply chain design or network analysis. All of these terms can be used to describe the same sort of activity. So what we've illustrated here is just a stacked bar chart that represents the number of facilities and the different cost components that we like to look at. So one relationship here that is typical is that as the number of locations goes up, it tends to be that the outbound cost decreases and the inbound cost, inventory, facility cost decrease. So when you look at those costs in conjunction, there tends to be a global overall minimum. So what we do is through this process is help define what that opportunity is and what that low point is. But it's also worth pointing out that under certain operating scenarios, depending on risk, some change management, some other components, you might not always want to select the absolute minimum component. I can think of a couple instances where we may have recommended something that wasn't the absolute minimum cost, but for other reasons for the business, it was a better opportunity to make another suggestion. Now, other than number of facilities, there's other factors that maybe can be looked at, right? So, for example, location of facilities. It might be the case that 2 well-placed facilities can achieve a better cost and service mix than 3 or 4 legacy locations. So it's not only number of facilities, it's also where they're placed. Another focus is function, right? So it may be that we have 3 full-line DCs, or maybe we have 1 main hub and 5 cross-docks. So the number of facilities is what's illustrated here, but there's really a lot of different components that we look at through the process. So I want to step through our methodology for doing supply chain optimization. We often joke that this first step, this perform discovery, where we seek to define really the solution context. Sometimes we joke that it takes half of the project effort because we're on site, we have interviews with folks, we take tours of the facilities, we review key processes such as inventory planning or route planning and transportation. We take a detailed historic view of the transactions, and we also want to identify those corresponding logistics costs. We end up looking at the data in detail by ship to, by SKU, making sure we're identifying the right territories. We'll review inventory levels and how the planning process is set up. And then we'll do a very deep dive on fixed and variable costs, particularly for the fleet and transportation, as well as warehousing and handling.
Steve, question for you. When you go through this discovery process with fuels and lubricants firms in particular, are there common things, opportunities that tend to jump out?
There do, and those common questions are there, right? Territory refinement is really a focal point at the beginning. A lot of these businesses have evolved over time, so there's a lot of legacy questions hanging around. So a lot of that gets distilled through the data process. We review those findings, so there's a lot of findings along the way. It's not just a sort of a big bang study, if you will. The next thing we do in our methodology is we create a baseline model. So now we're taking the reality of the data and we're converting it into our network model, and we calibrate that against the history to make sure we've got a good operating basis. The next step is to optimize that baseline model, because a lot of folks will say, hey, this is my network. Can I do anything better with my current footprint? And that's what we try to answer through this step, just to say, okay, here's my facilities. What can I be doing better? So that can be often a very valuable exercise. So that leads to what you were asking, Jen, about territory refinement. The next step typically is we apply growth factors. So there's been some growth in some different components of the business for sure, more packaged lubricants, et cetera. So we want to apply that, and we want to create some sort of design year out in time, typically 3 to 5 years out, that we want to use as our basis for the scenario comparison. And then we create a bunch of different network alternative models and perform some different sensitivities against those network models. This is a very, it's a feedback loop, right? So we get together with the team, we review the results, and we want to make adjustments. That's certainly been the case with our experience with the different lubricants and fuel models. Within the Commonwealth methodology, we also have the opportunity to perform some deep dive studies. So at a point in the process, we might say, hey, we're not understanding this enough, or there seems to be significant opportunity here. Maybe we need to go in one of these directions. So we've outlined possibly transportation optimization, DC design, some of these other ways that we can take the analysis in one of these directions. The last thing I did want to say about our methodology is that this is not an industry benchmarking exercise, right? So we're not taking you and comparing you to another business and telling you what % of sales you should have. This is different in that it's a detailed analysis of your supply chain. So we're trying to see how you can do better against your baseline, right? Let's make your business better over the long term. So that's the methodology. Typical data that's required of this process: historic sales transactions. We spend an awful lot of time in that discovery trying to make sure that we're understanding those transactions properly. Item master data, item details, how many units in a case, how many gallons per set, et cetera. Facility costs, so we'll review the actual budgets and try to characterize those details. Fleet activity cost. So asset lists, right? What you're actually spending on these on your fleet equipment, and ideally historic shipment data with movement stop details. So, this route on this day went from this point to that point. That is ideal data. It's not necessary. We can do an awful lot within supply chain optimization if your business is not mature in that sense. And finally, looking at inventory, we like to get some inventory snapshots and really understand how the business has been holding that inventory over time. So I wanted to call out fixed and variable transportation costs just because it's such a key part of the process, right? So what we do is we take that historic data and we really characterize each equipment type, right? Because a tank wagon versus a bobtail versus a full tank transport. We try to characterize what do those pieces of equipment cost? What does it cost to operate them? What's their average performance measures? Average gallons, et cetera. What's their average speed? All of this is important to make sure that we're representing the business properly within the model. I do want to point out that we also take that same level of effort against the facility costs, but the transportation usually makes up either the largest portion of cost or the largest portion of opportunity. So we take extra care of that in that realm. Then we take all this data and we do some scenario models. So typically we will run dozens of scenarios, right, based on different objectives and different operating conditions or constraints. So for fuel and lubricants, we've emphasized location selection, territory optimization, trying to assess the degree of centralization that will benefit the business. Also looking at production and sourcing alternatives. Think of how product flows through the network, right? Should we receive it centrally? Should we get it from a different source perhaps? And also some different transportation or equipment alternatives. So all of this can be considered in these scenarios. And this is stacked in this sort of a grid. Think of this, we call this our scenario matrix. So this is where we sit down and we review the results with the team. And there's lots of points of interaction on the way. We do not like to have surprises during our process. So effectively, we try to stack all the different costs, and we also characterize each scenario with a set of service metrics so that those can be compared as we look at some evolution of scenarios, right? And try to decide what's the right operating structure for the business in a strategic sense, and also help to mention those opportunities. We do use some very specific software tools in order to conduct a supply chain optimization. The three primary tools I've highlighted up top, LLamasoft, Descartes, and Agilence. These are very specific, application-specific software used for analyzing supply chain networks. We'll also supplement that software with either some of our own internal tools that we've developed over time or some of these other commercial tools, whether it's some cost to serve analysis or some visualization that can help our process here. So typical benefits. We end up for your business, identifying the correct number and location of facilities, and that tends to be the case for lubricants. For fuel, we correctly position resources for you, effectively saying, okay, which truck should be domiciled where? Based on the regions they'll service and their position to the rack. We identify a correct or an appropriate replenishment path for each product type, for example, C movers or some of the AB SKUs that might come out of a different source. We align your shipment territories and present a consolidated view of inventory, particularly on the lubricant side, because that's where you really have some greater decision making that can be done to say where those would be housed. Finally, overall, what we've seen is significant total logistics costs. A general rule of thumb, and this is not for fuel and lubricants only, but it's sort of a network design or a supply chain optimization, 5 to 10% opportunity. The range there is really dependent on how often you've done an exercise like this. If you've never done an exercise and your business has evolved and you really want to take a clean view at it, the opportunities can be substantial. But the primary savings that we've seen has been through lubricants, right? And trying to position those packaged lubricants in the repack and get after that transportation savings. Also significant savings through consolidation and trying to identify which facilities may or may not be redundant.
Steve, a question for you, and I encourage other audience members to ask them too. Do you need multiple either warehouses or fuel bulk plants for this kind of analysis to be helpful, or how many locations do you need? Could be another way to ask the question.
No, I mean, what differentiates a project like this with other industries is that a lot of these locations are owned, or they're very specific use, right? You can't just abandon. It's not just a regular warehouse. You can't just walk away from it. Hey, my lease is up. So there's definitely possibly some sunk cost or some some permanence to some of these locations. So that being said, right, even with one location, we could look at, hey, how can we supplement that location, right? Can we, should we put another location to offset some of these costs? So I don't think there's any sort of, floor to that number. Although a lot of these businesses tend to have a handful of locations, and that's probably ideal.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Very good. So that's the overview I wanted to provide, and I think we're going to transition over to the panelist side of things. So I'll turn it back to Ian.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Steve. That was a really interesting overview of the general process that gets followed in one of these engagements. The first example that we're going to consider today is a study that we did for Wilcox and Flegel about 2 years ago, and we're going to be speaking to Ron Huntington, who's a Senior Director of Supply Chain for that organization. So, Ron, welcome to the panel today.
Thank you, Ian.
Great. So, Ron, I'll ask you, this first slide here just talks a little bit about your company. Can you just tell us who Wilcox and Flegel is? Tell us a little bit about your business before we get started here.
Yeah, so Wilcox and Flegel is a third-generation owned family business, close to 70 years old now. We are a marketer, a distributor for ExxonMobil. We also do heating, fuels, ancillary products. We serve the commercial vehicle, passenger vehicle, and industrial customers up in the Pacific Northwest. Our territory is the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, parts of Idaho, and some of Alaska, mainly some gold mines, silver mines, and a couple of dealerships up there. So we have approximately, I believe we're at 11 plants now and about 17 convenience stores. So we do fuel and lubricants, and we've been expanding over the years, and so it necessitated us to reach out to Commonwealth and do our study that we'll be talking about.
All right. Well, thanks, Ron. That's a good overview of your company. For the next few slides here, we're going to flip it back to Steve just to talk about some of the details of how we did this study, why we did it and how we did it. And then Ron will be coming back to you in a minute just to talk about what some of the challenges were that made you want to do this study, what some of the benefits were that you got, and any lessons that you learned along the way. So, Steve, tell us a little bit about the engagement objectives.
Sure thing. Our general goals here, and these tend to persist through these studies, is really to reduce operating costs, make sure we maintain service levels, and position ourselves for further growth. Specifically, Wilcox and Flegel is really looking at the number and location of facilities with really an emphasis on geography, right? So there was as you will see in a moment, there were a lot of candidates that we looked at to try to flesh out the network. The other was the notion of centralization. They already had a central warehouse, but they wanted to see if they were utilizing it properly, as well as some discussion of repack. Ultimately, we did also look at fuel trucks. Where should they reside? And we actually found a decent amount of opportunity there, really depending on how the territories were assigned. So I just wanted to touch on a few things here. So here's just a business overview, right? So we typically do a slide like this, a demand heat map. So here's an overview of their historic network with the lubricants summary, as well as for the fuel, right? So small fuel and large fuel, broken up according to the facility. So that was their historic network in their business. And so what we did is we sat with the team and we said, okay, we really want to saturate the network potentially. We really added a lot of potential candidates that the model will consider using. So we ran a lot of scenarios like, okay, what's the best 3 locations? What's the best 4 locations? And a lot of those really help us understand what that trade-off point is in order to say, okay, at this point, we really reach a saturation level in terms of transportation benefit. And that helps us give a little room to roam, and also helps the team understand how the model is behaving. So we ran through a whole series of scenarios, like I said before, dozens, ultimately settling on a few high-level results, and I'll just run through these quickly. So primarily, the savings was driven by the location and the facilities and the resources. So some of the key enabling changes were the adjustment of a central warehouse location and also the adjustment of the Seattle area location. Those were identified as really our biggest opportunities. A supplemental opportunity was really in this Tri-Cities area, so that's out in this region. It's a huge geography out there, and there was a lot of waste in terms of travel time. So an additional location would have justified to support that geography. There was also some consolidation of some existing facilities, and really what enabled a lot of this was this redefined transfer schedule, right? How are we going to make use of that inventory in our central DC, and how are we going to deploy it through the network? So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Ian, to talk with Ron.
All right, thanks a lot for that overview, Steve. So Ron, let's talk in a little bit more detail about what made you want to do this project. So what were some of the business conditions or challenges that made you say, hey, this is the time to take a look at this supply chain network and see if we can improve upon it?
Sure. As I mentioned, we've been around for a few decades, and over that period of time, we have had multiple acquisitions, and that led to a pretty inefficient footprint for our network, a bunch of small locations and a lot of overlap and area and whatnot. So we wanted to have the study to help us decide, okay, where is the ideal spot for all of our plants? Regardless of where we currently are, where should we be? And so that has led to us to consolidating some locations and becoming much more efficient with our assets. So for us, it was just a matter of we had too much of a footprint. We had and too much overlap. We knew we were inefficient. So that's what led us to come calling to you.
Great. During over the course of the project, what were there any challenges in particular that you ran into or that you experienced as we were doing this? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, our biggest challenge, our ERP system isn't the most sophisticated. I'm sure many in our industry could sympathize with that. And so our data was imperfect, to say the least. And so we had some challenges there, but we worked through those limitations, and ultimately we were able to come to a successful calculation of our needs. But for us, it was really the data. And we had never done a study like this, so we weren't really prepared to pull all the information that you guys needed to get this done in a timely manner. So that was quite the eye-opener for us in the beginning. But we worked through it.
Sure. Yeah, I think most people are surprised to find that the data can be a bit of a challenge. But I would say over the years that we've done this, we've never seen anyone have perfect data. You guys didn't. Texas Enterprise did. Nobody does, and it's a matter of taking what you've got and filling in those gaps with what you don't have with intelligent assumptions and being able to drive the project forward to get to some conclusions. So talking about those conclusions, so we made some recommendations over the course of this study as to some ways that you could achieve those cost benefits. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those recommendations and just the extent to which you've been able to implement them so far? It's been about 18, 24 months since we wrapped up that study.
Sure. Yeah, we took your study and decided to get a central distribution center in Vancouver, which is a little further south than where we were at originally. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get the lube tank farm up and running due to some city complications with the drinking water folks. But we've been able to consolidate at least 3 locations at the Tri-Cities, as it shows here on the screen. I spent a week down there last week looking for a location, and we are acting upon all of the recommendations that you guys have put in. We have already found over a 7-figure reduction in our inventory by consolidating into the distribution center and then running stock load trucks to the satellite facilities based on that lead time allowed us to reduce their inventory levels from, on average, 15 days plus safety stock down to about 2 or 3 days plus safety stock. So cutting it down by 2/3 generally. So that's been a great thing, and our fill rates have stayed up in the mid to high 90s. So it's been a great transition for us, and we're definitely a lot more efficient now.
Yeah, that's right. Over $1 million in inventory savings and maintaining your fill rates. That's really a great testament to the value of taking a data-driven approach to this. So you mentioned that there've been some challenges with implementing some parts of this. Do you just want to speak to those? Like what have been the most challenging aspects of implementation that you found? Well, the three things that stand out in my mind right now, obviously, is COVID-19 hasn't helped, but it's really been the city governments up here in the Pacific Northwest and then the fire marshal with our projects. That's been the thing that's bogged us down the most. It seems like they're asking for a whole lot more information than they ever have before, and we got kind of caught unaware of needing to know every single constituent for every single product and providing 3,400 SDS sheets for fire marshals, and we've never been asked that in the past. So that's been quite the undertaking for us to gather all of that to make the move from our north of Seattle location to South Seattle, as well as the Tri-Cities location. So dealing with the new requirements for the fire marshal and then the city government people has been quite the challenge to getting all of these up and running. Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll work through those. So your business has changed a bit since the project ended. Do you want to speak to a little bit of how the business has changed and talk about how this network strategy, which was developed, how that aligns with the new realities of your business today? Yes. So we are actually trending higher this year than last year. We were recently awarded the territory in the peninsula area of Washington for mobile, which is another 700 or so thousand gallons in just in that area alone. And we've been we're growing close to 1 million gallons of new business. So implementing the changes we have has allowed us to become much more scalable, much more efficient. We're closer to our customer, as most of us know. I mean, the final mile is the most expensive mile of the delivery anyway. So having us shorten up our customer delivery runs has been a massive cost savings and efficiency savings. And then having the stock loads where we're doing a lot of drop and hook trailers, so we can run our stock load trucks overnight, which is one of the recommendations that you guys had given us, the optimal time of day to run those stock loads going through some of our big metropolitan areas. So running those early in the morning, overnight, weekend, without having warehouse people at the receiving end, we can drop the trailer, hook onto the return trailer, bring back empty totes, dirty drums, whatever we have to backhaul, and do it without people being present. So that has dramatically increased our ability to shorten our time. Drivers aren't standing around waiting to be offloaded and reloaded. It's just drop and go. So we've had some great efficiencies in all of this, and it's allowed us to scale much quicker than we would have otherwise. Great. Yeah, and the nice thing, once you've got one of these studies done, you've got a data model that's built, and as your business does change, you can refresh that data. You can make incremental changes to it and just revisit that model from time to time as it needs to be adjusted to business realities. So, well, good. Well, Ron, thank you so much for taking the time to explain this to everybody. Ron Huntington. Moving on, we're going to next be talking about the experience of Texas Enterprises. So. We're going to introduce Ed Looney, who's Executive Vice President of Texas Enterprises. And Ed, do you want to tell us a little bit about your business? Who are you guys and what do you do?
Sure. It was interesting listening to Ron there. Pretty much going to echo a lot of stuff he said. We are a fourth generation, actually working on a fifth generation ownership. We handle almost 2/3 of Texas and 11, 12 counties on eastern New Mexico. So, you know, it doesn't sound like much till you realize it's like 250,000 square miles that we have to cover. And having grown through acquisitions ourselves over the last 3 or 4 generations, certainly I think they've been acquiring since day one, but you look back at the last year, 10 years, 15 years, and there's been a ton of acquisitions, which has, you know, been one of the growth strategies for Texas Enterprises over time. I think the slide you're showing there with the different brands, really just different DBAs, when we've acquired, we've kept that market share name into place, and they all fall under the umbrella of Texas Enterprises. Probably very few of our customers know the Texas Enterprises, and they certainly know the DBA that they're doing business with. And yes, we have been asked, hey, why don't you just consolidate everything under Texas Enterprise and get rid of all that other stuff? Well, the folks in New Mexico don't exactly like Texas all that much either. So,
yeah, Texas can be a controversial brand, I guess. Anyways, well, thank you. Thanks, Ed, for that overview. Definitely a lot of similarities to what Ron talked about in terms of you know, how the business is structured, and you know, the things you've gone through over the last few decades. Steve, let's turn it back to you for a second. Tell us a little bit about what this project was about, what we did to analyze the data and the business, and what some of the results were, and then Ed will come back to you and ask you some of the same questions we asked Ron.
Yes, sir.
Steve. Yeah, tell us about the engagement, Steve.
Sure thing. All right. So overall, the objectives were similar, right? Operating costs, maintain service levels, support future growth. Some of the contrast, though, is that, as I was saying before, was a lot more about geography for the Wilcox model. For Texas, we were looking at opportunities. We didn't look at nearly as many candidates, right? It was more about how should the current facilities be utilized, what is the right number to use from that basis, but also we looked at various iterations of centralization. So a slightly different theme, but a lot of the same overarching topics here. So what is the number of optimal facilities? Where should they be located? Should we use a central warehouse, right? How many repack locations should we have? How should we handle slow movers through the network? Which items are inventoried and where, and which items should be cross-docked versus inventoried locally. So that was also a big topic there. For Texas, as we try to evolve our process and looking at these industries, we did 2 things to evolve. One is that we wanted to support the business's adoption of Tableau and different business intelligence tools. So we delivered the final results in Tableau. We did our data review in Tableau, and so that was something that was different, that we could help support them in their efforts and offer our abilities to be flexible there. So the other thing we did was these different business conditions. We modeled them independently. So we used the term scenario set. So we had a set of scenarios that only looked at general locations, right? So which location should we be in? How should we be optimizing territories? The next set said, okay, let's consolidate, right? What's that best consolidation opportunity? Should it be in Austin? Should it be in San Antonio? Should it be in Abilene? And then we looked at different flow alternatives for the mobile C articles, the mobile AB items, and different options for repack. So, and then we brought that all together. The power of that is by doing those independently, the team's able to sort of learn how things are behaving, so to speak, and then it all makes all the more sense whenever you bring it all together. So just wanted to run just through a couple different graphics. On the left, we've got our baseline model. So this is really historically how things were distributed. And in this business, you do a lot of things for a lot of different reasons. And so sorting through that historic data was always the fun part, as it were. And then we create a nice clean benchmark model, which represents a cleaned up version of that same structure. It says, what can we be doing? What would a clean version of our current network look like? And then we run some different scenarios where we compare that benchmark model to some different different alternatives. So you can see here that this is one of our consolidation examples where we blended some of these territories, and then you can kind of see how the model is just trying to fight to balance, right? Where's the extent of that territory? So again, with the Texas project, we're to a large degree leveraging current assets and looking at some centralization and flow themes within that central geography. So overall high-level results, significant cost savings opportunity, again, but primarily the savings were driven by consolidation and some of our centralization notions, and also some cleaning up of some territories. Key enabling changes was consolidation of some of those legacy / adjoining territories, really in this central region, and also engaging in central distribution of repack and also those slow-moving SKUs. By slow-moving SKUs, I mean sort of the Texas Enterprises slow-moving SKUs, and also the ExxonMobil C article, right? So we looked at different scenarios of how that's the C article mobile items should be brought into the network and also transferred through. So and finally, we really refined the deployment and transfer activities. You can see that this is more of a triangle as opposed to what we looked at with Wilcox was more just that central warehouse notion. So we had some different factors to contend with here. And overall, the intention was to reduce inventory by leveraging these transfers and increasing the transfer frequency and replacing real physical presence of product with a more frequent delivery structure. So I'll turn it back over to you, Ian, to talk with Ed and clarify some of these points and his experiences.
Steve, that was a good overview of kind of how we did what we did. Ed, let's back up a little bit and talk about the why, first of all. So what was it that made you want to do a study like this right now? What were some of the challenges or pressures that you were feeling that prompted that?
Yeah, I think most distributors on this call have probably asked similar questions, and certainly they weighed on our mind. And putting in a free plug for study group, we actually were sitting on a study group meeting when Wilcox Flegel were talking about hiring you guys, and had put some similar grids up, and I think they were 5-6 months into the study, and those of us from Texas Enterprise at that meeting immediately said, hey, this is exactly what we got to do to conceptualize or put the numbers to all this conceptual thought we're having in discussion. So it's been a great win, and we certainly have talked to Aaron and Ron quite a bit about how their project's progressing, because they're further along into it than we are. But specifically, if you look at it, it goes back to four generations and have grown through acquisitions. So we have a lot of real estate we've acquired over the years with these business acquisitions. So that was a challenge to say, hey, how do we get from, at that time, probably 15 different locations throughout Texas to, hey, we made a decision to align with mobile. So that forced us to, a few years back, to cut the cord with Chevron and Shell Pennzoil. And all of a sudden we were looking and saying, hey, you just shed a lot of GP. We got to get our cost out. So the other big driver was, how do we reduce our warehousing and delivery costs? And third, with the changes that were taking place, both with the reduction of those brands, but also with the alignment with mobile and their A, B, and C strategy, hey, we've got to get our inventory aligned. So I think if you look at those three, real estate reductions, reducing operating costs, and getting inventory down, they were our goals. And, conceptually, hey, this is where we got to go. But how do you make sure that what your gut's telling you is what you really need to be doing?
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, certainly I think a common thread that I've seen in this industry anyways is, growth through acquisition has created, sometimes it creates supply chain assets that are bloated and that need to be reduced and made more efficient. So
yes, sir.
Yeah, what kind of challenges did you find over the course of the project? Were there any surprises that, wow, this part was harder than we thought, that part was harder than we thought?
I think we had a little, not understanding Ron's data, we didn't really have any significant. We felt our data was pretty good. We're a SQL Server based company, so we're able to pull that data pretty good. And every time Steve and his team was asking us for something, we're like, okay, no, that's thousands of pieces of data, but we'd write a script and run it. So I think the data was good. I think the other, the winner for us is, hey, we knew the value of this project and what it could bring to the table, plus the cost we were paying for the consulting service. So, we assigned a team of 3, including myself and 2 other key people, to say, hey, we're going to be on this project from start to finish, because I never want Steve waiting on us for something. So between the data and the personnel assigned, I felt like, hey, we kept this thing moving pretty rapidly.
Great. Well, good. That's good to hear. So talk about some of the recommendations that came out of this study. What were some of the specific ones that you felt were most valuable, and to what extent have you been able to start working through those and implementing some of those recommendations?
Yeah, the biggest one was, hey, where do these plants need to be? We've acquired these. That doesn't make them the right location, but you can look at your market share and know where you're probably going to be at with your major facilities. So seeing the maps and the models that Steve did, hey, we had already started conceptually doing this. We had 15 locations. We closed the lease immediately, and then closed and sold another property that we owned to get it down to 13. But we really need to, after looking at these models, we're going to get this thing down to about 8 locations to service all these miles and customers. And so that was good to see confirmation that, yep, we can operate this thing on far less overhead and properties than we've been operating on. I think the other piece was, as far as you're saying, hey, what is the challenges and benefits? We said, okay, yeah, we're going to reduce inventory by default of closing locations. Some will get more, some will get less. We have probably, since we have some hurdles on the properties, which I'll talk about next, but we have reduced, I think, inventory far more than I'd anticipated at this point in time. And I've always felt like we've had good inventory turns. We're very fortunate we manage that right down to each SKU, and we're turning that stuff 12 times a year, excluding fuel. So, we're real proud of that. But hey, how do we go to 13, 14? So that's been a good win when Steve and his team helped us implement this new mobile strategy of AB products, full pallet only, the C products coming out of Chicago. I think that's been a surprise win for us. Good.
Great to hear. What kinds of challenges have you had with implementing? You mentioned a few property level challenges and things like that. What have you found as you've gone through to implement this?
You heard Ron talk about it. It's not so much it's getting the right industrial property in the zone. Steve's mapping pointed, hey, optimally, if you could put a plant right here, and I think it was a quasi triangle area that we needed to be in, and we're talking the San Antonio South market, and we knew that we've got 4 or 5 properties down there that we need to close up and consolidate, get closer to the fuel racks, get a facility that we can cross dock in, just got too much property. And we've had a couple of bids that have not worked out. We're on our 3rd one. So, we've only been about a year maybe into this thing, not even after the consulting study was done. So, this is a 3 to 5 year plan. We went into it with that aspect, but we certainly would like to see the San Antonio property get done. We got a bid in for a third now, and if we can get that and build, we'll stay on track. And that'll be the catalyst. So just getting the right properties. I agree with Ron. Hey, dealing with the fire marshals and stuff moving forward, we're gonna handle. We'll probably have less difficulty being in Texas than he does Washington, Oregon, because this is a petroleum state, so they understand that business model. The other thing, which is impediment when you're moving, I underestimated it, but we run by branches and divisions. So when you're saying, hey, we got to realign these customers with where they should be distributed from versus where they were acquired a distributor from. So, we've actually acquired our competitors, and we've kept some of those distribution zones. And when you look at that, you suddenly say, oh, crap, these really should be coming out of warehouse A, and they're currently coming out of warehouse C, not even close. But you're talking about moving $50, $100, couple $100,000 of GP. that's got to be managed correctly because, you know, you got the inventory, you got the routing that impacts that. And quite frankly, we got managers who are paid on the performance of their facility and profit sharing. So, you know, we've got to be diligent about how we whack or move 200,000 of GP and then holding that manager accountable for that. So that's taking some time and work. We've gotten the low hanging fruit already, but the next big moves are going to be big chunks of GP, and really don't want to do a lot of that until we get the 2 main warehouses up and running that the model said, hey, we need to do, because there's a lot of money to be saved here.
Great. Well, thank you. What so since you've completed the project, I guess it's been about a year now. Has your business gone through any changes that have required you know, dusting off the model and adapting it a little bit to new business realities, or how stable has the business been for you?
Well, the model's been pretty consistent, and like I said, we're kind of new into it a year, and we still feel firmly that, hey, it's predicted the right locations on that property. As soon as we can get that piece resolved, we'll get San Antonio, and then we've got a concurrent bid going on in Austin. You guys did a great job with the, hey, where should the repacks be? Where should the cross-dock main plants be? So we're kind of excited about that. There's big dollars involved, and I'm like, you know, Steve, if Steve's even half right on his numbers, there's going to be a pile of money saved every year.
He's usually at least half right, so that's the good news.
But I think that's what got our attention. Hey, even if he's half right, there's a lot of money to be. So I think the roadmap is great. We still actually probably monthly are running that database on where the customers are, because we're continuing to reassign accounts to branches. But it's not, you can't just, as everybody on the call knows, I can't just say, hey, move these 10. All right. Well, we got to be careful where those 10 are going. Are they going to be on the right truck, the right route? Do we even have the inventory at that warehouse? So all that stuff has to be mapped over, including discussion with what rep's going to service these accounts. And then when all that's done, then we, you know, pull the trigger, and hopefully everything goes seamless. So that's been an ongoing project for 12 months. And then, you know, with the big plant changes, that's what we're working on. Again, I think that's where the real change in inventory and distribution costs are going to be impacted to the positive side.
All right, good. Well, thanks very much. And so both Ron and Ed, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share some of these really valuable learnings with our audience here. You know, just to kind of, you know, wrap things up. So as we said at the beginning, Commonwealth Supply Chain Advisors is a supply chain consulting firm. And we specialize in this kind of work. And, you know, if anybody on the call today would be interested in just having an introductory conversation, we'd be more than happy to do that and just kind of understand some of the dynamics of your business. And, you know, if nothing else, point you in the right direction with a few things, but, you know, perhaps lead to some more substantive discussion. So thanks for everyone that attended, and I'll turn it back over to Jed now.
Ian, Steve, thanks. A couple quick questions I had as I was listening to it. Appreciate both Ron and Ed sharing their perspectives, and your solution was unique to their specific situations. But one thing I saw that was different, I'm curious why. Wilcox and Flegel, it seemed to be a centralized distribution model and go out from there. With Texas Enterprises, it wasn't a centralized model. What was different about those two companies that led to those respective outcomes?
Well, I would say two things. One is just the demand basis, right? So you know, the Portland metro area was such a strong draw. Also, that's where a lot of supply comes from. It seems to be a natural point there. Whereas in Texas, they really had 3 large markets they were playing, functioning in, right? Austin, San Antonio, and Abilene. So, you know, supporting really different segments of the business. So they all needed to be addressed, and ultimately, it's really just how the scenarios led us. It wasn't my expectation, to be honest, at the beginning, but that's where it led us.
Yeah.
If anyone has anything to add to that.
Well, I think it's
I think that highlight. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to just add in probably the biggest difference is just the miles. You can't, you know, we can't see how you'd have one centralized location for Texas Enterprises. You know, when it takes 8 to 9 hours to go from one end to the other, you're just not going to make that daily delivery.
Right.
Yeah, our,
And this
our,
is Ian.
longest, our longest restock run from our distribution center to Spokane is about 5 hours. So I would agree with Ed.
Yeah, and that's one thing unique that I saw here was, you know, the solution is unique to the own intricacies of each company. And then Ian, a second question, which is, we touched on this, a lot of our junk or overlap or non-optimization as we've made acquisitions over time and, you know, rolled in customers, we haven't got to strategically choose it, but we'll develop this model here to optimize what we're doing today. And as we think about the future, when we make another acquisition, give me some sense of what we're doing today is flexible to accommodate the future, which we don't know what that's going to look like.
Sure. So, you know, a couple of things that we try to do. Number one, at the beginning of a study like this, we go through what we call a future visioning session. And we really try to, if any acquisitions like that are anticipated, we want to try to get that, you know, out and discuss it and say, you know, what might that look like if you were going to expand, what direction would you go in, and so on. So even if you don't know if you're going to do it, we can start to anticipate some of those things and maybe even run some scenarios and say, hey, if you were to add, you know, 20% revenue to the east, for example, how would that change the network potentially? Because you want to get a network that is going to be resilient enough to, you know, to withstand as many changes to the business as are reasonable. So we try to anticipate that to the extent possible. And then, of course, there's always, you know, unexpected changes to the business and things that, you know, that nobody anticipated. And, you know, the value to doing that data modeling is you've got that model, it exists, you can dust it off, you can refresh the data, and you can, you know, without having to start from scratch, from square one, you can rerun that model and see what some of the answers are. I'll just, if I could comment on the last question as well about how, you know, centralization versus decentralization, how the answer, it was a different answer for, you know, for each of the two companies. I think that underscores the value of having to run the model, you know, doing the data modeling. I mean, it's not about benchmarking your company against, you know, what did Wilcox do or what did Texas Enterprises do, because that's probably the right answer for me. It's not always. Every business is a little bit different in terms of the product mix that they're handling and the geography that they have to cover and, you know, countless other things. And so, you know, while there are some general rules of thumb that come into play, you know, you've got to just do the science and run the numbers and see what the answer is for each individual company.
Well, sounds great. We're approaching the top of the hour here, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But Ian and Steve, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. For the audience members, we will send out a recording of this to you. Also send out Ian and Steve's contact information. I know if you have any questions, they'd be happy, as Ian said, to engage and talk and do what they can to help. And also, Ron and Ed, thank you guys for sharing so much as marketers, your experiences. I'll also send out their contact information if you have any specific questions for them. Both Ron and Ed would be happy to do what they can to help too. Appreciate everybody and continue to stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you.